the Zoom.
Ah,
Good afternoon, Mr. Highwell.
oh, good afternoon. So maybe we can begin now. Welcome everybody to Universitas Negeri Jakarta.
Recording in progress.
The State University of Jakarta. This is a meeting of the monthly seminar with the overall theme of language, society, and education. And I'm very happy that Professor Srikant Sarangi from Denmark is our speaker today. But I'll invite Professor Dr. Irfan Iskandar, Deputy Rector, to say something. Right, Irfan.
Thank you, Mr. Highwell. Our rector sends his best regards to all the participants, and particularly for our source person for keynote speaker today, Mr. Sarangi. And welcome to State University of Jakarta. And I would like to express my gratitude to the Director of Postgraduate School, Prof. Dedi, the Chairperson, Bu Arita, and of course the one who is a consistent and loyal supporter and facilitator of this program, Mr. Highwell Coleman. And I read a bit about what is being talked about within a few minutes. Mr. Sarangi will discuss about 3 directions of applied linguistics as I see the summary. And these directions are the professional language, professional discourse, and professional practice. And this signals a strong shift of linguistics, the transformation from language per se to the language as an instrument of communication. And I find this topic interesting because we have been exposed to the term core English or core ring of English and outer ring of English, but then we suddenly go to the term of global Englishes by crystal or international Englishes, and then particularly in pronunciation, we transform from the standardized English into intelligible English. This emphasizes the importance of communication in the end. And to summarize what we'll be talking about and addressed by Mr. Sarangi is the definition of applied linguistics that I quote from Anne Burns. Wait a minute. I think she comprehensively defined applied linguistics as taking language and language theories as the basis from which to elucidate how communication is actually carried out in real life, to identify problematic or challenging issues involving language in many different contexts, and to analyze them in order to draw out practical insights and implications that are useful for the people in those contexts. I think in this area, Mr. Sarangi will give the enlightenment to all of us who are interested in this applied linguistics sphere. Thank you, Mr. Highwell, and thank you, everybody. Mr. Sarangi, thank you very much for your willingness to be one of our source person.
Okay, thank you very much, Irfan. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Professor Srikant Sarangi. We were chatting earlier today, and we realized that we have known each other for 37 years. We met at the University of Lancaster in about 1986. Since then, Professor Srikant Sarangi has worked in many different parts of the world, and his 2 main institutional affiliations are the University of Aalborg in Denmark and Cardiff University in Wales. And his he's focused throughout his career on language being used in professional situations, for example, in medicine, communication between patients and doctors, for example, and other professional contexts. And he's incredibly productive. He's launched and edited 3 journals, I think, including the Journal of Applied Linguistics and Professional Practice. And he's worked in collaboration with universities in many different parts of the world. He's really incredibly productive. So while Srikant is talking, if you have any questions or comments, can you put them in the chat box, please? And then we can ask Srikant to answer the questions or respond to the comments at the end of the session. So, Srikant, over to you. We can't hear you yet.
I had muted myself.
Right, now we can hear you.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Right, greetings from very cold and wet Denmark. I got here from India on in the weekend. It was all white snow. So it is both jet lagged and weather lagged, if there is such a concept, as I speak. When Howell approached me, I promptly accepted, but it's very hard to fit in a generic topic like applied linguistics and its future directions within the allocated time. So I'll make some very, very strong assumptions and assertions as I go along to keep to the time, but hopefully we can return to many of the issues in the discussion afterwards. There will be an element of autobiographical kind of narrative in this talk, although I will not try to foreground it, because that is my professional trajectory, if you like. I'll probably skip a few slides. I have put in too many, but hopefully, if they are of interest, we can revisit them. So let me turn to the talk itself now, and the title being Apply Linguistics of and Adds Professional Practice. So these are the 2 dimensions, the applied linguistics of professional practice, that would be the direction in which applied linguistics could go. But at the same time, we have to introspectively reflect on ourselves as professional practitioners. So applied linguistics as professional practice. Those are the 2 aspects that I want to touch on. Both these aspects pose epistemological, ontological, and ethical challenges, especially when we talk of applied linguistics, which is too heterogeneous. Some people call it an interdiscipline in itself, and therefore it's very difficult to adopt a rigid set of methodological and ethical principles of research practice. I'll say a little bit to set the scene, particularly what we mean by applied linguistics, and we can have hundreds and hundreds of definitions and what it is meant to be. But I start with Michael Halliday, who considered applied linguistics as a theme rather than a discipline, and even called it a form of activity to simply designate the numbers of things that we try to do in situations where language becomes central to our lives. And this is what was echoed by Christopher Bromfitt, who very clearly said applied linguistics is for real-world problem solving, both theoretically and empirically, where language is of central issue. But Bromfitt qualified it by saying we need to address language-related problems, whether they're identified knowingly or not, in non-specialized language practices. But what has happened over applied linguistics, particularly English for specific purposes, English for academic purposes, we are too focused where language is for specialized practices rather than non-specific language practices. And I'll come back to that. My colleague, Celia Roberts, wrote a paper in 2003, 20 years ago, titled Applied Linguistics Applied. So basically, she was trying to make a case that applied linguistics is clearly becoming increasingly theoretical and conceptual, moving away from practical relevance and reflexivity. And what she was saying is to qualify Bromfield's point that we should not only address real-world concerns, but we need to do this collaboratively in a sustained way with our practitioners, with our fellow professionals. I think that's the key point that I will elucidate in this talk. The one other axis that we need to think about briefly is the interface between theory and practice. Applied linguistics being more applied, more practically relevant. So what's the role of theory or linguistics? Again, Halliday says theory to improve effectiveness of practice, and practice would then contribute to refinement of theory in an ongoing fashion. And he somehow preferred the term applicable linguistics rather than applied linguistics, but that's just as a backdrop. So to set this talk, I want to begin with a series of questions, and hopefully some of these will be answered today. What makes applied linguistics research and practice distinctive from other non-applied linguistics research and practice? I think this question has been preoccupying myself for a long time because I edit different journals, particularly Text and Talk, a very discoursive journal, Communication Medicine, very much in the realm of healthcare practice, and the broad Journal of Applied Linguistics and Professional Practice. And when I see manuscripts submitted to any of these journals, I always ask myself, does it fit with this journal or should it go to another journal? So then I begin to pose these questions that we need to ask ourselves. What is it that makes our research applied linguistics rather than non-applied linguistics? Is it the kind of research we do on, for, or with paradigms, like Deborah Cameron and all said it back in '92? Is it the way we identify and formulate problems and research questions? So is there a particular way applied linguists formulate their research questions differently from others? Is it about the relationship between researchers and the researched, the applied linguists and the practices or the discourses they study, as in action research, participatory research that contributes to new knowledge? Is it about choice of specific theoretical, methodological, and analytical framework, including being eclectic? So should applied linguists be more eclectic than discourse analysts, for instance? Is it about reflections at meta level on our research practices and processes? Or is it solely about the practical relevance of our findings, the so what question? Do we answer that? And finally, and I'll come back to this in the concluding part, is it about the dilemma of rigor versus relevance, echoing Donald Schoen, that I'll come back to? So these questions should be at the backdrop of my talk, and some of these, as I said, I will try to address during the talk itself. So I'll try to focus on three key trajectories within applied linguistics, just for the sake of time: language for specific purposes, LSP, professional discourse studies, particularly in the workplace and organizational context, and then professional practice studies, which is the main focus of this talk. These three trajectories, as you can see, all relate to real-world problem solving. So these are all activities oriented to the real world. So being very crudely generalizing about LSP. Obviously, LSP focuses on language features much more than anything else, but also the metalinguistic aspects, and tries to make connections at ontological and epistemological levels. These ventures have been very successful in teaching interventions, particularly remedial teaching, in many different contexts, education, health, management, law, but they have remained rather narrow and restrictive in their operation. The reason being, there is a big written bias in LSP. And also the circumference is rather narrow in terms of research sites. And this is particularly visible when we see the amount of research done on language for academic purposes. Remember what Bromfield was saying, that we should focus our attention on non-language specialized contexts. So my feeling is that LSP researchers can benefit from looking at what goes on in professional discourse and practice studies. Moving quickly to professional discourse studies, this is very much the domain of sociolinguistics and discourse, workplace discourse studies, studying language use, communication, and discourse in social contexts. We have very rich linguistic interactional accounts as outputs based on talk interaction focus, issues of ideology, power, hegemony, interrelationship between discourse and social change. There is a huge history of those kind of concerns, and many studies attempt what you might call a thick description in Clifford Geertz' sense through ethnographic participation in the workplace. So Chris Candlin, my colleague, and I have categorized these studies into three groups. What we call the genre-based studies, focusing on specialized written registers, very much resembling LSP. Studies of talk and interaction in workplace settings, particularly in ethnomethodology, conversation analysis, and discourse analysis. And finally, what comes closer to professional practice studies are studies which are problem-centered, interventionist, sometimes involving close collaboration between discourse analysts and members of various professional practitioners. However, professional discourse studies, like other applied linguistic research endeavors, operate with a deficit model of researcher-research relationship. There is very little collaboration or collaborative interpretation between the researcher and the researched, and there is always an assumption that we must first invent and find and then apply our findings to professional discourse settings. And professional practice studies, I would suggest, would be premised on very different assumptions. So that makes me to highlight what I mean by professional practice studies. But before I do that, a few comments on what we mean by practice or expert practice. Now I go to Donald Shawn, and he talks about practice being an ambiguous term. So he highlights two particular meanings. So when we speak of a lawyer's practice or a clinic practice or an accountant's practice, we basically mean that what the clinician or the lawyer or the accountant does in real life. In other words, we're talking about their performance, their clients, their handling of cases, their performance. But when you say somebody's practicing the piano or the violin, we're not talking about performance, but preparation for performance. So practice refers to performance in the case of lawyer's practice or clinician's practice, where the practice refers to preparation for performance in the case of the pianist or the violinist, or for that matter, what we want to talk about as professional practitioners. Going back to Bourdieu, and he talks about practice having two components. One is a cognitive dimension. Practice always implies perceptions. It is discursively constructed. Practice is also culturally relative. So the manifestations of practice, what Bourdieu would call habitus. So it becomes our routine ways of doing things. These are historically determined, very durable, but always allowed for flexibility, contingency, and improvisation. So practice is not static and rigid. Following from Bourdieu's theory of practice back in 1997, now we have a plethora of research under the label practice theory. I think that tells us practice and theory cannot be divorced. These are not two concepts. There are theories of practice as there are practical theories. And I would like to highlight or single out 3 elements that are crucial to professional practice studies. The concept of deliberate practice, drawing on Erickson, the concept of reflective practice, drawing on Schoen, and the phenomenology of practice, drawing on Van Menat. So let me go through each one of them in turn. Erickson talks about practice as continuous improvement of performance, very dynamic and evolving in nature. And he very strongly emphasizes expertise is not just a matter of experience. We can't say, I have taught for 20 years, so I'm an expert. So experience counts, but it's not the essence of it. Expertise has to have something that is much more reflective, allowing us to improve, identify our specific weaknesses, the Achilles heel, if you like, at problem solving and not just practice generic abilities. And in order to develop our expertise through practice, we need to seek what I would call hot feedback on performance. And this is how we can try and improve upon our weaknesses. So practice is hours and years of becoming, whereas performance is the being. So the becoming and the being is the practice and the performance end of the continuum. Erickson talks about the 10-hour rule, 10 hours per day, and 10-year rule, 10 years in one's lifetime in professional life. And he has been studying particularly musicians, violinists, and other musicians in many different contexts, concerts and so on. But not just hours and years of practice, but experts practice differently. I think this is the key point Erickson makes, what he calls deliberate practice. So many of these studies are based on chess players, musicians, and athletes. It's a notion of differentness. You don't just practice in a kind of a ritual way like a robot, but practice that is in relation to the challenges. And he makes a distinction between when challenges exceed your current skills as opposed to challenges meeting your current level of skills. So deliberate practice is when the challenges confronting you exceed the current level of skills. And this is where you have to practice deliberately on the basis of your weaknesses and trying to elicit feedback, hot feedback on your performance. If the challenges that you meet in the classroom or in your workplace meet the current level of your skills, then practice becomes very ritualistic and feels very effortless. So to sum up, the science of practice, the science of deliberate practice, according to Erickson, has 4 steps. It must have a clearly defined stretch goal. So you stress the goal beyond your expectations, beyond your current levels of skills, your comfort zones, if you like. So you must set your goal that is outside the box, beyond the comfort zone. Then you put full concentration and effort, look for immediate and informative feedback from your peer group and for your clients. And then you repeat this practice with reflection and refinement. And this reflection, or what Sean calls reflective practice, and he makes a distinction between reflection in practice and reflection on practice. Reflection in practice is something that we do unconsciously when we are performing. Whether it's a doctor, a teacher, an engineer, reflection is embedded within our performance, within our activities. And then once the activities is finished, we can reflect on our practice as well. So it is both a post hoc reflection, but also reflection in situ, while you are doing it simultaneously. So taking it to Donald Schoen's and this classic work, The Reflective Practitioner, he poses the question about the epistemology of practice. And the question he asks is, what is the kind of knowing in which competent practitioners engage? In what extent professional knowing is like or unlike the kinds of knowledge that we can access through academic textbooks, scientific papers, and journals? And he answers this question by saying that these competent expert practitioners exhibit what he calls a knowing in practice, most of which is tacit. In other words, practitioners have a capacity of intuitive knowing, or intuition. And it is that intuition that we need to capture as part of professional practice. The same thing is echoed by Patricia Benner, a very well-known researcher in the field of nursing, who says an expert nurse no longer relies on analytic principles, rules, guidelines, and maxims. Because they have so much of experience, they are able to have an intuitive grasp of the presenting situation without wasting too much time by thinking about alternative diagnoses and solutions. So this intuitive grasp of the current situation is part of expert practice. And this is very much classically elaborated by Daniel Kahneman, one of the Nobel laureates, what he calls thinking fast and thinking slow. So for him, intuitive expertise is thinking fast in juxtaposition to thinking slow, and he identifies two different systems of thinking. The system one is the thinking fast. You think, you react, you respond automatically and very quickly with no effort and with no voluntary control. This would be the situation of responding to natural disasters, or how firemen and ambulance people respond to emergencies. So that's thinking fast. Thinking slow is when you go through a number of effortful mental efforts, mental calculations and computations, and it takes time because you have choices and you want to concentrate and you have to exercise your agency. So that is system two. System one and system two operate distinctively differently. And finally, Van Manen talks about phenomenology of practice. So professional intersubjectivity is constituted in pathic and gnostic knowledge. So we need two parts of expert practice: the experiential understanding, the embodied experience, as well as the rationalistic, scientific, technological knowledge base. And in order to be reflective, to gain or to maintain this reflective attitude, we have to be mindful of two things. We have to bracket or parenthesize pre-understandings. We should not make too many assumptions when we engage in research or look at data. Because if we do so, then what he calls the living meaning will not emerge. So we will then impose meaning on the data according to our pre-understandings before we came to the data. And the second thing that he says is we should not reduce what we see as a phenomena in front of us, because then we will never address the uniqueness of that phenomenon. We'll then try to standardize or normalize what we are trying to engage with or we are trying to analyze. So these are the ways in which we try not to impose what Kenneth Burke said, a deterministic screen over the phenomena that we only determine in the light of our embodied knowledge and experience what is new. So then the newness, the uniqueness disappears or is never explained. So in a summary kind of a way, I can say expertise is a culmination of many things: credentialed, certified knowledge, embodied experience, deliberate reflective practice, intuition, interest, something that I'll come in the very end, as well as ethics. And we can add more things, but this will do for the time being. So now let me move to the main part, the professional practice studies, that we can study professional practice at different levels, but they will have different levels of significance. We can study professional practice in interaction with clients, so professional client interactions like teachers and students, doctors and patients, lawyers and clients, and so on. We can also study professional practice when professionals interact with other professionals, the interprofessional encounters. When professionals interact with technology, documents, and so on. When professionals can be observed in their laboratories, in their workspaces, via field work. We can also study professional practice through interviews and questionnaires as accounts of practice. So we can study professional practice in many different trajectories. There are clear relationships between professional theories of knowledge and professional interactional theories, as in psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and other healthcare settings. So one of the claims that I and others have made is professionals' knowledge of language and interaction is very sophisticated, far more sophisticated than what we see in textbooks and training programs. So I would even go and claim that talk and interaction is an essential component of their expertise. In the healthcare system, I call it is an integrated part of the healthcare expert system. So if you want to place in a continuum, it's much easier to study language and interaction in professional client encounters rather than interprofessional encounters, because that is very opaque and might be beyond what we know or our abilities and our levels of expertise. Two very key scholars in ethnomethodology, Michael Lynch and Wes Sharrock, said professional practice cannot be reduced to language use or interaction. So when we're studying doctor-patient interaction or legal interaction in a courtroom, it is not just an organization of talk or in interaction. There is much more that goes behind the organization of talk. And these are the practices that we need to unravel, we need to unpack. So it is not enough to say that, for example, a jury deliberation or a medical diagnosis is simply an organization of talk. And once we move beyond language to multimodality, and this is becoming increasingly salient in many professional practice studies, how surgeons operate, how teachers explain the gestures, the kinesics, the body movement. So the more and more we get into multimodal practices, it poses even more challenges analytically and methodologically for us as applied linguistics researchers. We also need to look at professional practice in terms of role responsibilities. What roles and responsibilities they activate, they enact to manage, to display their expertise, to manage uncertainty and ambivalence, and how they accomplish communicative goals strategically and persuasively in institutional and organizational domains. So I have, and this is a little bit of the biographical or autobiographical element of this talk. Back in 2005, I was asked to give in the BAL conference, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, what was called the Pete Corder Lecture. And I was arguing then that we should have something called Applied Linguistics of Professions and Organizations. So building on the literature on applied linguistics, language for specific purposes, and professional discourse studies, and along the lines of cognate scientific approaches to the study of professions. If you look around, there is sociology of professions and organizations, anthropology of professions and organizations, psychology of professional organizations, and that made me argue that we should launch something of a applied linguistics of professions and organizations back in 2005. And this transition to applied linguistics of professions, I said at the time, should be characterized as a shift in focus from language and discourse as a language system to professional discourse as an expert system. So context-specific and content-specific, explicit and tacit knowledge sources become critical or criteria to how we understand professional practice. Once we shift to professional practice, professional discourse as an expert system, it is bound to provide not only some territorial gain, applied linguistics will grow and appreciated beyond education, beyond the classroom, beyond pedagogy and academics. But on the other hand, it will pose some very concrete theoretical, analytical, and practical challenges. And that has led from 2005, and this happened in 2010, when the Journal of Applied Linguistics that was re-labeled as Applied Linguistics of Professionals or Professional Practice, that I co-edited with Chris Candlin, and the inaugural issue was 2010. And in one of the comments from the inaugural editorial simply says how we engage with our ethical practices, both in terms of our research methodology and our intervention agenda. I think that's what I mean by applied linguists as professional practice. So we need to reflect on our research methodologies and how we intervene, and both have ethical consequences or ethical mandates. So if we think about applied linguistics extending to cover professional practice, we need to go beyond language education and language acquisition, because we can study professional practice not just in education, but also in a range of professional domains: healthcare, social welfare, mediation, law, media, corporate sectors, journalism, information technology, interpreting, the environment, climate, and so on. It doesn't mean that we need to totally overlook the educational domain, but within the educational domain, we need a shift of focus from learners to teachers and trainee teachers in terms of methods, materials, and strategies. For instance, if we want to study teachers and trainee teachers' pedagogic practices in explaining scientific phenomena, grammatical rules, giving written oral feedback, preparing teaching materials, then all these are still topics, but we need to look at them from the lens of professional practice. So these can be still seen as professional practice studies, rather than just thinking of this as the mainstay of education or pedagogy. Although I realize it's not easy to define or divide domains of applied linguistics and education and pedagogy. It's simply a shift in focus rather than anything superseding or replacing something else. Finally, I want to comment on how professional practice studies would intersect different orders of discourse. And this is the final part before I conclude. If we want to focus on professional practice and professional discourse, then we need to consider at least 3 other different orders of discourse that intersect with professional order or the professional discourse or professional practice: the institutional organizational order, the personal experiential order, and the public or the societal order. So these are different discourses or orders of discourse, if you like. And these orders of discourse inevitably overlap in a given social context, but they are heuristically separable. So if you look at professional order, which is on the right-hand side of this figure, the scientific expertise and the embodied experience, it is clearly interfaced with the institutional order, which is part of the societal public order that is changing all the time, transforming. This is manifest everything at the level of interaction, talk and language, but we can't ignore the moral order, the codes of practice and ethics, the technologies, the expert systems that mediate the professional and institutional orders, the organizational, the institutional ethos, if you like, and the life worlds of the professionals and the clients. So it is much more complex, but all very much interlinked and interwoven rather than being seen as completely separate from each other. So professional practice cannot be studied just in itself, but embedded with a professional practice is usually embedded within institutions. How we conduct research, how we publish, how we teach, these are within the context of an university, the context of a hospital, the legal system, and so on. So the more we think of professional practice as being embedded within institutions, then we need to organize what are the key constituents, key factors of an institution. Berger and Luckman back in 1967 said there are only 5 key elements of institutions: habitualization or routinization or typification, historicity and control, how institutions legitimize things, what are the different roles, and how socialization happens within institutions. So all this need to be part of institutional remit of professional practice. Or Mary Douglas very classically wrote the book called How Institutions Think. How institutions can be seen as legitimized social groupings, as organizations of information, how institutions keep forms, codes, files, and records, how institutions decide what is same, what is identical, who is eligible, what is fair, and what's objective, and how institutions do classifying, actually through professional practice, define categories, establish criteria, processes of inclusion and exclusion. So institutions need to be understood, whether it's education, health, or law. We need to look at the institutions before we can study professional practice properly. Then we move to professional practice, how professionalism grew away from bureaucratic administrative forms of work control. So from being rule-based rationality to knowledge-based expertise. And these are some of the features that we can think about professionalism. There has to be a system of knowledge that we call professional skill set. That gives rise to professional authority, that they have better knowledge than us as lay people. This authority must be somehow approved by the community. If the community doesn't recognize a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher, then that authority falls flat on the ground. There has to be a code of ethics to eliminate unethical practitioners. And finally, there has to be a set of values, cultural values. So then we can think of professionals as symbolic, that we know that people who belong to professions have esteem. We value their practices like a doctor and their career. Some of the features of professional practice would be in terms of what Talcott Parsons, the eminent sociologist, called functional specificity and affective neutrality. So professionals, unlike intellectuals, are a bit much like applied linguists, unlike linguists, or clinicians, unlike biomedical scientists, are focused on specific functions of knowledge. So they are specific in terms of the functions of what knowledge they have. And in the process, they have to be neutral rather than become too attached to the clients or to the people they serve. So affective neutrality and functional specificity are two key indicators of professional practice, according to Talcott Parsons. But that poses a paradox. The more and more we want to be student-centered, patient-centered, client-centered, how can you manifest affective neutrality? Because you are kind of asked to be involved, to help them and be themselves. Elliot Freidson, a very well-known sociologist of profession, says there is always an ideological aspect to professional claims to knowledge, because professions can only exist and sustain themselves by creating their own clienthood. So the way they think about who is their client, what constitutes deviant behavior. So this is a whole area that I'm not going into, what I would call the ethics of expertise. How ethical is expert practice? But I will leave that here for the time being. So in summary, a professional practice is constituted in all these things: expert knowledge or functional specificity, specialized language, jargon, discourse, narrative, special kind of expert knowledge, if you like, affective neutrality, part of being a corporate organization or institution, monopoly and power. All professionals have monopoly and power. They have autonomy and independence. They have a code of ethics, but most importantly, they are driven by a sense of altruism, a commitment to others, to the community, to public service. So professionals belong to specific communities of practice. They are members who are said to be mutually engaged. Their engagement is driven by some kind of a joint enterprise, and in the process, they have a shared discourse or interpretive repertoire. And Charles Goodwin framed this in what he called professional vision, that professionals have a particular way, a socially organized way of seeing and understanding phenomena. And that makes them very distinctive, a very distinctive interest group in any societal setting. And this vision, what he calls the professional vision, is discursively manifest at three levels: how professionals code whatever phenomena they observe, so they code it in a particular way, like we code data as researchers. Then we highlight something that is of interest, like a doctor or a teacher or a researcher highlights a specific phenomena that needs to be salient and needs attention. So that's highlighting. And then we articulate what we highlight in a particular materialistic way. And that becomes our discourses that somehow represents or indexes our professional practice. In research, in professional practice, it is often the case that we try to go for a simple dichotomy between expert versus lay in many discourse analytic studies. But clearly, there are many different stages between the lay, the novice, and the expert. So in psychology, in cognitive science, one would like to make distinctions, calibrate these different levels of expertise, from starting with a novice to an advanced beginner, to being competent, to being proficient, to being expert, whether it's in healthcare, in education, and in any other professional settings. But such calibration of novice expertise continuum in as many as 5 different layers is intuitively appealing, but it's very difficult to calibrate them and manifest and understand them phenomenologically and discursively, although it is a very interesting task for us to undertake, how certain teachers and doctors and lawyers manifest their expertise professional expertise at different levels, and how certain levels of expertise are either mutated or transformed during performance and during practice. So in summary, expertise is something that is mediated through ethical conduct for accomplishing desired ends. There has to be a function, a purpose. And this applies to us as applied linguists or language communication discourse researchers. So we focus on expertise and its many different sets of colors, contours, ethics, particularly what we do with talk and communication, and ends in terms of practical relevance and how we translate our research. However, there are many challenges to studying professional practice. Professional practice is not just about scientific expertise or scientific expert knowledge and embodied experience. It's also mediated by many interlocking competing trends. And I've just listed a few. One that is very seminal and very important for us, particularly in the field of language studies, is globalization, language diversity, mobility, the status of language, language policies, and so on. So what is policy making? What are policy making practices in terms of the globalized world, in terms of language and communication? The increasing bureaucratization, the audit culture, routinization and standardization of practices in healthcare, education and teaching, assessment, and so on. Marketization and consumerism, that the client is right, the student is right. Technology, the expert systems, the digital and the social media. The AI is going to remain, it's not yet, but will become the challenge of the future for education and healthcare and so on. At the same time, we want to humanize our professions to become oriented to values, morality, and ethics, and to customize, to try and make our expertise individualized or tailored to individuals and clients. How much time have I got, Howell? Can I conclude in 5 minutes?
Yes, please carry on.
Okay, so I just have 3 things to say. I called it instead of a conclusion because I don't want to conclude. It's not something that can be concluded, what I've said. So I'm going to open up a few things that we need to consider in terms of where we go with applied linguistics in the future. One area to think about is applied linguistics and interdisciplinarity. The second aspect is applied linguistics and collaborative interprofessionality or interprofessional collaboration, if you like. And finally, the dilemma of rigor or relevance in applied sciences more generally, and certainly for applied linguistics. I think I said at the very beginning that applied linguistics is a heterogeneous field. It has always been. And for some, it is a culmination of many disciplines or an interdiscipline. So one of the premises is that if applied linguists have to engage with real-life wicked problems, then we have to go beyond our discipline, beyond our comfort zones, because real-life problems do not come prepackaged in disciplinary nuggets looking for simple applied linguistic solutions. So it is almost inevitable that we have to reach out to other disciplines, that we have to expound our disciplinary remits, our disciplinary base, in order to address real-world problems, whether it's in education, healthcare, or elsewhere. People think of it interdisciplinarity with the metaphor of the fabric, like the quilt, that you can bring various disciplines, weave them together, their concepts and practices, so they fit together in an overall pattern. But the reality is far from the truth. It is full of tensions and full of challenges and full of contestations. So there are nuances surrounding the phenomenon of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, even the terminology. People don't agree what is it that we mean by interdisciplinary work. But the bigger question is, could interdisciplinarity turn out to be an exercise in intellectual rigor rather than the pursuance of practical relevance? Interdisciplinary work could simply be intellectual work rather than applied work. And some people have called for disciplining interdisciplinarity to avoid the scenario that everything goes, anybody can be bedfellows, and we can just find one other discipline, and then we're becoming interdisciplinary. So waving this flag of interdisciplinarity has its risks and needs to have a health warning. But more importantly, I want to suggest that interdisciplinary research in itself does not always translate into practical societal relevance. Only some do and many don't. So the preferred term, at least in healthcare research, is what is called translational research rather than interdisciplinary as such. And this is synonymous with applied research. Translational research has to address three key challenges, because there is the distinction or disconnect between pure research and applied research. In biomedical research, for instance, not all biomedical research, particularly in genomics and climates and so on, is not driven by an immediate social practical relevance. So biomedical research, for instance, millions and millions of dollars are spent, which may or may not lead to any clinical interventions. Then there is a mentality of blue sky research, first find, then apply. But that could be decades and decades away when the relevance of the scientific findings could find their way into clinics, societies, or into the classrooms. Then finally, we assume that there are no tensions and problems when you bring together different disciplines or different practitioners and researchers together, because there are many epistemological and ontological divides, and these are manifest at the discursive level, the interpretive repertoires they inhabit, and these cannot be negotiated, and many kind of scenarios or many practices actually are doomed to failure rather than success. I said professional practice is constitutive of knowledge and experience manifest at explicit and tacit levels. So when we as applied linguists, as language, discourse, communication scholars, look at any professional practical issue, a problem, we are armed with analytic and descriptive solutions. We are very sophisticated at the level of analysis of data and descriptions. But we may lack context-specific knowledge, which are characteristic of complex professional institutional settings, that is essential to discriminate what is right or what is wrong, what is good and what's bad, what is called discriminatory expertise. So we may have expertise at the level of description and analysis, but we may lack this discriminatory expertise because we don't have knowledge of content and context sufficient enough. And it's because of this lack of content and context-specific knowledge that we need to enter into interprofessional collaboration, to work with teachers, work with doctors, work with social workers. And that has been my life throughout my career. And this interpretive burden cuts both ways. For the applied linguist, to make sense of professional practice and expertise, it's very difficult to understand professional practice on our own. At the same time, the professional practitioners find it very hard to understand and interpret our repertoire, our meta-language, thus affecting the uptake or impact of knowledge through the research process. So collaboration is not just a matter of translating or intervening, but actually working together through the data collection, through the interpretation of the data, and so on. So what happens when an applied linguistic account of professional practice is subjected to further interpretation by the professional practitioner, and there are disagreements, what I call experts on experts. And this is contested knowledge rather than just some kind of compliance or some kind of negotiated knowledge base. Just two examples. Collaboration at the level of doing data and doing analysis. I remember when I was working in Cardiff, in the field of genetics, we wanted to do interdisciplinary collaboration under a project called Genetics and God. So the idea behind this was that the more genetics is increasing its knowledge base, people are going to be less and less oriented to God or faith. So we got together theologians, sociologists, psychologists, social scientists, linguists, but we never agreed what counts as data, because different disciplines have different ideas about what's data. Particularly, philosophers and theologians thought about interviews as contrived data. They only think of just think of an example rather than doing an interview or questionnaire. They don't believe in manufacturing data through interviews. So the whole project kind of fell flat on its face because we as disciplines agreed on the content, the topic, but not on methodology. Likewise, when my work with the genetic professionals, interprofessional collaboration, it can also fail because we never agreed whether a good transcript is good data, because it cannot capture many things. Feelings, emotions can never be transcribed, and they did not trust that it is authentic data to be analyzed. Likewise, in the data, if I call something, this is authority, this is therapeutic, this is power, then they would not agree because they don't share the same repertoire. And that means collaboration will stall until we negotiate. And unless we renegotiate and recategorize the data, there will be no uptake and no intervention and no impact of our research. So in order to progress in collaboration, I listed at least 7 different things that we need to take on board. Affordable presence, reciprocity of perspectives, problematization of the things that we want to do jointly, thick participation, very much long-term informal ethnography in a particular context as a precondition for thick description, interpreting the data collaboratively, what I call hot feedback, which is mutually reinforcing, and critical reflexivity. I can comment on these a lot more in the discussion. It will take time, but these are some of the things that I have tried as a way of trying to make collaboration effective and particularly useful or impactful. And above all, we need to foster what I call communities of interest, extending the notion of communities of practice, which is very useful in the context of education and training, but not so much in the context of research or research practice. So by communities of interest, I'm talking about research settings, and it concerns scenarios in which we as researchers come from different communities of practice to the practitioners, the professional practitioners like healthcare, education, pedagogy, law, social welfare, where we might share interest, but not practices, discourses, or interpretive repertoires. So it is our mutual interest, our community of interest, that will guide the research process, the interpretation of the data, the findings, and its eventual intervention or impact. And my final point, coming back to Donald Shorn and the reflective practitioner, he says there is always, all professional practitioners, all experts are confronted with this dilemma of what he calls rigor or relevance. Do we want to go in for rigor, the rigor of analysis, the rigor of science, or do we want to go for relevance, the practical relevance? So that is why he puts it as rigor or relevance, although we can talk about a way of rigor and relevance. So I would suggest rigor and relevance can be accomplished simultaneously, but there are situations where one may get pulled in one direction rather than the other. So then how far you are an applied scientist dedicated to practical relevance, and how far you are into publishing in journals and not, towing the lines of a discipline or theoretical knowledge, and that's the kind of a challenge. There might be conflict of interest vis-a-vis rigor and relevance. And if altruism is an overriding goal for applied scientists, generally, and applied linguists, then relevance must give way to rigor. But then how do we meet our scientific, institutional performance indicators of publishing, being within the discipline, and so on? I think these are real things that we need to think about. So for many of us, particularly those practicing researchers in applied linguistics in the university sector, I think it's a walk in the tightrope, almost non-ending, walking in the tightrope. On the one hand, you have to sustain and maintain the rigor of your research, the principles of your disciplines or interdisciplinary research base. But at the same time, as an applied scientist, you need to address and foreground the relevance of your research for practice and for professional practice, which means the contingencies that you need to cope with, the uniqueness and uncertainties, which will pose practical ethical problems. And this needs constant reflection, a state of reflection. And with this, I would like to end and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Srikant. There's so much to think about here. Could you?
I can stop sharing.
Yes, please. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. There's so much to think about here. My immediate reaction is I need to read this before I can comment on it. Would it be possible for us to?
Yes, I can.
Share your PowerPoint.
I need to add the references and I can send them. Yeah, I can do that later today
Right.
or tomorrow.
That would be really, really useful. I can't see any comments or questions in the comments box yet. Can I begin?
I haven't said anything controversial, so.
All right, somebody has raised their hand. Marion.
Yes, we can. I have Marion here.
Oh dear. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I was curious if I thought it was fascinating what you were saying about expertise and experience and the relationship between them. So I was wondering, does kind of people talk about experts by experience, you know, in certain circles as well. You find this phrase used referring to the person who has experienced the thing that has been diagnosed or classified as a mental disorder or some such thing. And I was wondering, does this concept of expert by experience kind of fit into your analytic framework that you kind of proposed there? In terms like, you know, I've talked to you before, I've had cancer, and sometimes I feel that as someone with cancer, I have an expertise by experience that isn't necessarily even understood by nurses, say, who do the, you know, a lot of the nitty-gritty work and the people who come into contact way more than oncologists or doctors, for example. But there's certain things that I know that I understand and that other people who've had the same experience as me understand, for example, in our closed private Facebook groups, that even say the nurses wouldn't necessarily understand. So I was wondering if this kind of expert by experience concept has any relevance to you, or if you see any use for it.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. Actually, it does, and it has, but it's on a different of a trajectory. I think when people talk about lay expertise, that lay people patients, those who have chronic illnesses, and cancer would be one such scenario. So the expertise by experience is absolutely integral to that particular notion that you are talking about. So when patients, because of their accumulated experience, they can have some knowledge of diagnosis, even treatment or whatever. What I was talking about is in the context of professional practice, just experience is not enough. If we look at even doctors or teachers, if we simply say, we have clocked in 20 years of experience, so give me another increment in my salary, that doesn't work anymore.
Right.
So in professional practice, experience is simply taken for granted. It is a basis, but not enough as we increasingly move towards performance-oriented competencies, if you like.
Right, yeah.
So now we have to talk about how much of that experience is not just, 10-year rule that I have worked for 10 years, so I must be an expert. How much of that experience is embodied? And then I was trying to qualify that going back to Anders Ericsson's deliberate practice, that experience needs to be complemented with hours and years of practice, but deliberate practice. The practice that tries to identify what are still my weaknesses. Where can I learn and do better? How can I get immediate feedback on my performance so that I can still improve? So practice makes perfect, not experience.
Right. Okay.
So I'm not trying that experience is replaced with practice. I think we need to go beyond mere experience or counting our hours and years of experience with particular times of practice, the deliberate practice, the reflective practice, reflect on practice, reflect in practice. So those, and then this intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So all those things are what makes somebody an expert. But what you said is absolutely right in the field of, I think, Simon Beck, if you look at the concept of citizen expertise,
Mm-hmm.
that now the citizens are experts, the mothers are experts about child rearing and child care.
Mm-hmm.
The activist groups are experts on climate change. So the citizen expertise is not to be ignored.
Right,
But
right.
I was restricting my talk to professional practitioners, those doctors, lawyers, teachers, researchers, applied linguists. How can they become how can they become being through practice?
Right, right.
That practice requires more than experience. Does that make sense?
Sure, no, it does. It's just at times I experience a bit of a disconnect that I felt was because people hadn't really drawn on the expertise of of experience of illness itself. So really simple things like during COVID, like a lot of my cancer treatment was the tail end of COVID. It dragged on quite a long time in hospitals and whatnot, and a really simple thing. It's like, people would assume if you've got a runny nose or whatever, it's because of, your immune, your lack of immunity, or that you've got COVID or whatever. And it doesn't, it had never crossed their minds that actually not having.
I could simply say we can't discount experience, but we can't count on experience alone.
Yeah, no, sure. I just wanted to give the example. Like, it didn't cross people's minds that the reason for having the runny nose is because you don't have any nose hair when you're on chemotherapy, because you lose your hair. So, I mean, these are kind of really basic things, but they, despite...
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're over time, and there is one more...
sorry, okay.
Sorry, there's one more question from Pangesti Widarti. Can you see that, Srikant?
Oh, sorry, can you read it out?
Yeah, it's quite a long one. Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering, in medical sciences, students need to learn language for supporting doctor and patient communication skills in the future when they graduate from medical faculty. As a lecturer, how can an applied linguist combine her professional language usage to support the doctor and patient communication, whereas the communication contains medical registers?
Yes, I mean, again, I don't want to undervalue the importance of language in such settings. There are two key questions that we need to ask, I think, going by what I was trying to highlight in my talk. We should not assume that language use or professional language use in the medical setting is unsophisticated at the level of medical educators or non-linguists. So they actually have a very sophisticated level of knowledge about language and interaction. They may not have the meta language. They may not know how to label an adjective or an adjunct or something else. So this is where we might be able to help them, that this is how it is called and this is how it functions or works in a particular context. The second thing is that, unfortunately, in my experience of working within the medical setting for 3 decades, the communication, they don't use the word language so much, but communication is still regarded as a set of skills rather than as something that we regard as a set of resources, context-specific knowledge, whether it is grammatical,
Ini bisa aku
communicative.
teman.
Sorry.
Aku udah.
Hello? I think somebody wanted to say something.
No, no.
No, okay. So I was simply saying that unfortunately in the medical curriculum across the world, not just in the Western world, but everywhere else, language is seen as a set of communication skills. Particularly, the experts are the psychologists, not linguists. So it is a psychology-driven communication skills training rather than applied linguistics, discourse analysis, or communication research driving the language needs or the training of medical students. So there is a lot of work to be done for applied linguistics and discourse analysis to be visible in the medical curriculum. If that is the case already in Indonesian, I welcome you, but it is a huge challenge to break through the barrier of psychology, particularly the discipline of psychology that has tried to freeze communication as a set of skills and with no regard for the discipline of language and communication sciences. So the scenario is not as bright and as optimistic as it might seem. I hope that answers the question. Howell, are you there?
I will.
I think,
I will.
or maybe it is past the.
No, no, no. I will maybe out of Zoom because the poor connection.
Right. I mean, if there are no further questions, I am happy to end unless there is anything else anybody wants to ask.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sarangi, for your presentation. Maybe I will leave the Zoom because the poor connection.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
Bye.
for all participants.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Excuse me?
Yeah, Bu Pangesti.
Yeah.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I asked a question and then two points actually, and then have already answered by Mr. Sarangi. But I would like to tell you, but when I did my master thesis and my PhD thesis, I did doctor and patient communication in written, not the oral one, but written. And then it is on the basis of question and answer of like a sporting genres, the language of advice columns actually.
Right.
And then I went to the medical library to get the register, the technical terms to to understand the text. And then I
Right.
did very well, but I don't know later on when we have a faculty of medicine in the future. Yeah. So I'm wondering about this. Perhaps, yeah, should be like a doctor, professional one, yeah, the lecturer, professional doctor, may combined with applied linguists, I think. What do you think? It's
Absolutely.
because, yeah, actually, when we communicate, doctor and patient communication, sometimes the patient, lack of the register, and then the doctor doesn't realize that the patient is. The patient doesn't understand anything about the register. Yeah. So I think both of them can work together, I think. This because
Sure.
sometimes it's not easy to communicate with patient, especially uneducated one,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And the challenge also for us to understand the medical language as well,
Yes.
the concepts, because we can't, as language experts, we don't have the necessary expertise to unpack
Yeah.
the meanings and the implications of the medical language itself.
Yeah.
So
both
that's
of
why
them should
the
be working
collaboration is so crucial.
collaborate. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sarangi.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for participants. Okay.
What about our absent, Miss?
Nggak ada
Recording
absennya, Bu.
stopped.
Nggak ada absennya nih kan.